I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. I want you to imagine something with me. I want you to imagine that someone you care about very deeply, maybe your brother, sister, mother, father, child, was locked in a state prison right now, 2020, during a pandemic. And I want you to imagine that you got a letter from them saying these words, which I'm going to read to you from a real letter. The building is getting sick. I tested positive for COVID. Pray for me. I love you all. I am really sick. My body hurts and it's causing me to breathe bad. I am getting scared. I do not want to die in prison. These are the real words of Tremond Thomas, who wrote to his sister, Swakeda Ellis, as COVID-19 spread through the state's prison system. I'd like to show you a picture of Tremond's face so that you know who we're talking about here. And I'm really sorry to say that Tremond died in November at only 44 years old. Swakeda, his sister, described her pain saying, "My brother shouldn't have had to go through this. They are bringing the virus into the jail system and it's like they don't care." So public health experts have long warned about the unfolding, colliding crises of COVID-19 and mass incarceration, estimating that officials' failure to release people from overcrowded, unsafe jails could cause more than 100,000 additional COVID deaths across the country. But even before the pandemic, even absent the pandemic, the degree to which we have packed American prisons and jails, absolutely overfull, was under discussion as a massive public health and safety crisis. And even before the year 2020, there was a wave of people running for office who wanted to make a change. Reform-minded prosecutor candidates won elections in high-profile races across the country, promising to end cash bail and take other prosecutorial practices and policies that would make people safer in a way that was more restorative, more transformative, and less carceral. They were promising to address the criminalization of poverty, the criminalization of substance use, mental illness, sex work. They also promised to release people who were serving these kind of exceptionally long, harsh sentences that were associated not with serious wrongdoing, but in fact with a tough on crime ethos that dominated the public discourse and dominated American politics for decades. And I'm very, very excited to be sitting here today about to interview one of those reformers. San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin is joining us today, having just published an article on all the ways that 2020's challenges present new opportunities for prosecutors who want to try to do better and want to try to find new strategies to decarcerate prisons and jails. District Attorney Boudin, thank you so much for being with me here today. Really happy to be with you.
Thank you, Emily. Great to be on the show again.
So I want to start because we're looking at California. I feel like we're watching this kind of like dance between you and George Gascon, because you are both have been branded as you run as reform candidates or as change makers. And what's interesting is he was your predecessor as San Francisco District Attorney, and now he's dropped a platform in Los Angeles that seems in part perhaps pushed or motivated by this continuing conversation and this evolution that he's undergoing, as well as others may be undergoing, on criminal legal policy. And I wanted to talk with you about an attack that was lodged against Gascon, but I think is also relevant to the work you're doing in San Francisco. So Orange County DA, we're going to talk about some intra-DA fights.
I love it. I love it.
The WWE of DA infighting. It's going to be great. So Orange County DA Todd Spitzer said that Gascon's policies, I think the quote was, "They've not been tested, they're off the reservation, and a recipe for absolute failure." So setting aside the incredibly problematic phrasing he used, I want to just get to the substance of what he's saying. Is he right? Is decarceration or reducing incarceration during a pandemic somehow unsafe?
Absolutely not. And with all due respect to my colleague, Todd Spitzer, I have to disagree with him on this on a number of different counts, including the choice of words, as I think you pointed out, Emily. But here's the reality. We know that mass incarceration makes us less safe. When I ran my campaign for district attorney in 2019, we focused in the campaign on all the ways in which mass incarceration undermines community safety, tears families apart, puts people at risk of sexual violence while incarcerated, the ways in which it starves local jurisdictions of the resources needed to invest in things like education and public health and housing that we know are at the root of so much behavior that we choose to classify and treat through a criminal justice lens. What 2020 has shown us, even more clearly than ever could have been imagined before, is the ways in which mass incarceration also tremendously undermine public health and public safety in the process. I believe that 44 of the 50 top sites for spread of COVID-19 this year have been jails or prisons. Jails or prisons are not just a public health risk for those incarcerated within them, like the man you profiled earlier who died while incarcerated, but they also put every single one of us at risk. In San Francisco County Jail, for example, approximately 800 people go in and out of the county jail on any given day. People who work there, people who are cycling through in short periods of incarceration, public health staff, and those people go home to their families and their communities. They bring the virus in, they bring the virus out, and they put all of us at risk as a result. We must decarcerate if we are serious about public health and if we are serious about public safety.
And I hadn't thought about it in terms of those numbers. I mean, like I'm in a place where I'm still alcohol wiping my groceries, and I would be so anxious. I'm happy to get I'm lucky enough to get delivery groceries. I would be so anxious going to the grocery store. So picturing 800 people cycling through an environment where the majority of people in there are unable to socially distance, can reach out and touch another human, might be sharing a toilet with 40 other people, no masks, no hand sanitizer, and maybe even no soap. Like the fact that that is happening every day, even in a county that is otherwise as cautious as San Francisco, is wild to think. It's not every day that guests come on here and shock me with a number. So I figure I would just highlight that's a clobber over the head.
I'll give you another shocking number, Emily. About 1 million people in this country work every day as correctional officers in state or federal prisons. So again, just looking at the people who are working as correctional officers, without getting into the janitors and the health workers and the program managers and the security specialists, we have over 1 million people every day going in and out of state prisons. The number is far higher when you include county jails and non-sworn staff. So all of us, one way or another, are connected to America's system of mass incarceration. And in the context of COVID-19, that presents a very real public health and public safety risk.
That shared vulnerability is really interesting to think about. So speaking of officers, I want to transition into talking about another aspect of the platform that has been advanced by reformers like yourself. When we talk about decarceration, I think a lot of people sort of write that off inappropriately or inaccurately. So he's just going to let everybody go, and the streets will be flooded with murderers and all of this. But that same aspersion is not cast on the work that reformers like yourself are doing on police accountability. Because I think on police accountability, we've seen sort of that be the pre-existing trend, which is that police officers were very often let go and not held accountable for acts of violence. I think this is reflected in the way that Black Lives Matter took on Jackie Lacey, whom Gascon just beat in LA. So I'm wondering if you could take a moment to speak about how the policies you're talking about relate to calls from demonstrators, other community members for police accountability.
Well, look, this is, again, an issue that was a key campaign issue in 2019 for me. And the movement that got me elected fed into a broader national movement in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others in this past summer. And I think what we saw was a new and heightened scrutiny on the ways in which policing is racialized, the ways in which use of force and the broader might of the criminal legal system is disproportionately focused on the backs of Black and brown communities. It's in my view, a welcome and long overdue focus, because we need trust between communities that are impacted by crime and law enforcement. And we don't have it right now. And we're going to rebuild it in part by enforcing laws equally, by holding police who commit crimes accountable the same way we do anybody else. And that's not something that has happened in pretty much any part of this country in pretty much any moment in American history. Now, I'm proud to say that the team in my office, the Independent Investigation Bureau, that focuses on police use of force cases, has filed 3 separate cases, one of which dates back to an unlawful killing from 3 years ago, in which we filed the first ever homicide charges against a San Francisco Police Department officer for an on-duty killing of an unarmed Black man. It's not about sending more people to prison or asking for more people to be incarcerated. In fact, none of the 3 officers that we filed charges against were detained, or we're not asking the court to put them in jail pre-trial. We're treating them the same way we treat other people, which is a respect for the presumption of innocence, a respect for due process and the right to counsel, but also an insistence on equal enforcement and accountability when force is used in a way that rises to what we believe is criminal conduct.
So let's talk for a second about the pretrial release policy that you just touched on. And I'd like to start with why, you've talked about ending cash bail. I'd like to begin with why that's so important in this moment in particular, but I'd also like you to especially touch on, I will say, we retweeted the advertisement for this particular show on Twitter. And so I got a taste of what your Twitter mentions are like, because we were both mentioned in the same Twitter thread. And there's a lot of people who seem, I will put this very elegantly, extremely concerned about the safety implications of your policies on cash bail. So I'd love to have you talk about why changes in pretrial release are necessary in the pandemic in 2020, and also whether this is safe.
Absolutely. Well, my sympathies that you got caught up in some of the trolls on my Twitter account. There's actually a good expose. This is a tangent, but that came out in San Francisco that showed a lot of the trolls attacking San Francisco progressives are not real accounts. They're fake accounts with fake identities, and they're set up really just to spread misinformation and hatred. It's a sad part of modern American politics. I think we saw President Trump promote that and normalize it, and it's trickled all the way down to the local level. But the real issue here is about the inequities of money bail and the ways in which money bail undermine public safety. This isn't just about decreasing pretrial detention. It's about increasing equal protection under law. So let me explain in brief how money bail works and how it undermines public safety. Money bail is a system in which someone who's wealthy can buy their way out of jail without regard to the strength of the evidence or the severity of the charges against them. Meanwhile, someone who's poor or indigent languishes behind bars simply because of their poverty, even if they're accused of a low-level misdemeanor, for example, shoplifting. What we've done in San Francisco, and I'm proud to say we were the first DA's office in the country to have an across-the-board prohibition on our assistant district attorneys asking the court to impose money bail, is we simply focus on safety. We focus on risk rather than on wealth. If someone is so dangerous that there are no conditions we can impose on their freedom that protect the public, then they shouldn't be released from custody regardless of how much money they have in the bank. On the other hand, if someone who's presumed innocent can be released in ways that are consistent with public safety and their return to court, then they should be released, again, without regard to how much money they have in the bank. And so our system focuses on asking the court for detention in those limited cases where we're dealing with violent offenders who we don't believe we can protect the public from pretrial. And everybody else, we focus on the fundamental right to liberty and the presumption of innocence. That's what the Constitution requires, and that's what we do in San Francisco.
So, setting aside the trolls.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, me too. Let's always set aside the trolls. And I appreciate the conversation of liberty, which all too often is maximized for corporations and minimized for actual humans. You've been talking about these solutions since well before 2020. And I'm wondering, how have you seen real people, not internet trolls, but real people in San Francisco respond to your policy changes, and how has the conversation around you evolved?
Well, it's funny. Most of the trolls don't live in San Francisco to begin with. To the extent they're even real accounts, they're from all across the country, but few of them are in San Francisco. We had about 55,000 San Francisco voters that voted for Trump. in the last election. It's a really small percentage, but it's a loud and vocal minority here. People in San Francisco are ecstatic at some of these changes. People appreciate and understand why equal protection requires a risk rather than wealth-based approach to pretrial detention. And we've seen crime rates fall by about 25% this year. What it shows is it's possible to safely decarcerate. The fearmongers, the Trump supporters would tell you that if you release people from the county jail, crime rates will go up. And we've seen the opposite. We've cut our county jail population since I took office by approximately 40%. And crime rates overall have fallen by about 25%, including things like robbery and assault and auto burglaries and shoplifting. All of those categories are down by double digits this year.
That's really it's an important statistic that is all too often kind of propaganda the other way. So I'm really glad to have you share that. Do you have any specific narratives you'd want to share of, groups or elected officials who've really been, who've played a great role in leading to some of these beneficial changes you've noted, or individual people who you feel have tangibly benefited from these policies?
Well, look, I mean, of course, when we think about crime and public safety, we always are focusing on, and of course, the headlines often focus on those cases where something goes wrong or someone is victimized. And we have to do a better job supporting victims of crime and making sure that we're dedicating resources to helping uplift them. And so a lot of folks want to focus on the couple categories of crime that have gone up this year. And those are important. We've got to do a better job bringing those down too. But to your question, this is work that is done in partnership with community. It's done in partnership with reentry programming, pretrial diversion in San Francisco, Glide Memorial Church, Felton Place, the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. So many of the key stakeholders who understand that it's not enough to simply put someone in jail for an arbitrary period of time and then dump them back on the streets. That does not build safety. We need to be thinking in every single case about what reentry looks like and how we can disrupt the cycle of incarceration and crime. And we've got a lot of folks here on the ground in San Francisco, in community, doing that work to make sure that when someone is released, they've got somewhere safe to go. They've got the support, the structure, the supervision, the resources to succeed, so they're not just cycling in and out of the county jail.
So when you talk about your work, I notice that you very often frame it in terms of safety and success for everyone, kind of including something that should not be abnormal, but totally is, including people who are in jail and in prisons as part of the community you're trying to keep safe. You're trying to keep survivors of crime safe. You're trying to keep ordinary people living in your county safe. And because a lot of what you're trying is, it sounds like evidence-based, but also new. And because you share goals with other reform-minded DAs across the country, I'm actually wondering, do you and others of your peers who are interested in the same outcomes have a way of sharing what you've learned on the job, sharing strategies? I know every jurisdiction is really, really different, but are you coordinating with others who want to bring about this vision of safety?
Absolutely. We have a great formal and informal, coalition of folks who are doing this work. And we communicate from, every mechanism you can imagine. We follow each other on Twitter, and we have phone calls, and we attend a lot of the same trainings and conferences. There are some great networks that bring us together for events like Fair and Just Prosecution, among others. And on top of that, we are, all of us, dedicated to transparency and publishing the results of our pilot studies and our efforts. So, for example, I just published a report out of the San Francisco District Attorney's Office looking at our efforts to decrease the jail population in the context of COVID-19. That report is available. It's on the internet. We've shared it with networks of other prosecutors, and we hope that it will provide best practices, lessons learned, examples of what other folks can do, and maybe some things to avoid doing, so that we're learning from each other's successes and mistakes.
So speaking of challenges that others around you are facing, I think you're a little bit farther down this road of bringing new ideas to a DA's office. And we've heard stories of others who have really struggled, not with the voters. The voters elected them. The voters are very excited about their platform, but struggled with the internality of their own office. You know, people who have been prosecutors for perhaps many, many years with a very different worldview. And I'm wondering if you could share any lessons learned. I mean, are you winning hearts and minds within your own office? And if so, how?
Absolutely, we are. And look, this is difficult work. Changing office culture, changing bureaucratic and institutional culture takes time. We've got a great organization, a newly established organization founded by my former chief of staff here in California called the Prosecutors Alliance of California. That's another example of an organization helping us do that work around legislative issues and cultural issues. I think we have a lot of folks in my office who are really excited about the changes, particularly in the context of Black Lives Matter. I received emails and correspondence from my own staff who reached out and said, and this includes people, by the way, who had been there for years before I was elected, who reached out in the context of the Black Lives Matter uprising this summer and said, I'm so glad I work in this office of all offices, and who were having crisis of consciousness about which side of this historic national issue they were on, but felt they could do good because of the kind of policies we were implementing. Of course, not everybody is going to get on board. That's always going to be true. We're always going to have some holdouts. And one of the things that I like to remind myself and remind them is, the status quo approach to being so-called tough on crime was never held up to the same standard that folks are trying to hold up our policies. And I encourage folks to ask us for empirical data. Let's show that what we're doing works. But let's remember that nobody has ever presented one iota of data that throwing people who are addicted to drugs in jail cells or in prison cells decreases addiction, decreases access to drugs, decreases purity of drugs. There's simply no evidence that that approach to the war on drugs worked. We have tons of evidence it didn't. And yet there's still a seemingly blind commitment to doubling down on these failed approaches simply because of an addiction to punishment, rather than because of transparency or data. So let's focus on what works. Let's hold ourselves and this failed status quo approach to the same high standard and make sure that we're putting our money into policies that actually yield the results our communities need to be safe.
So as a last question, I know we're almost at time, but somebody, I don't know, posted a question somewhere on the internet of like, if you could whisper in Joe Biden's ear for 30 seconds. So I'm going to broaden that question. If you could ask the incoming Biden administration for help advancing your issues, advancing your vision of safety, I'm wondering what you would ask for, what you think would be most beneficial, and whether you have any hope of getting it.
Well, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful primarily because of the grassroots energy around this issue and the growing movement at the local level and the national level, raising awareness about the inequities in the criminal justice system, about the failings of the status quo, and because of both President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris's public recognition of some of the mistakes they made in the past on these precise issues. I think this is the moment for change. And I think change starts with a recognition that so many of the problems we treat as a criminal justice problem are really social problems that can be addressed more humanely, more effectively upstream. And so what I would ask for is investment in the kind of community prevention work that we know has proven effective in so many parts of the country and the world. Things like restorative justice, treatment on demand for people who are suffering from drug addiction, safe consumption sites with which the Trump administration has blocked and fought against, and an end to the war on drugs, which I think should really be within our reach at this point.
Thank you for answering that quite concretely. I always appreciate when people ask for specific things. So that's great. Let's hope his team is watching. And DA Boudin, it's been such a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for coming on the show again and for sharing your vision and this update. It's been really great having you.
Thank you, Emily. It's great to be here. Stay safe and happy holidays.
You too. Well, our nation is going through two crises, a deadly pandemic and an ongoing epidemic of violence, police violence against Black people. But there are things our leaders can do to help. There are policies they can implement. There are policies that can address both of these crises together hand in hand that make people safer and put fewer people in cages. I was excited to hear a discussion of accountability for police take place in the same breath as a conversation around decarcerating prisons and jails, bringing people home, making people safer, and investing in things that actually work, like treatment, like education, like opportunities. In the era of urgent life or death social distancing, it is important to note, and as we close our show, I think we have to go back to the fact that inside locked facilities, people don't have the option to stay safe from COVID. And I don't just mean people who are sentenced to time in these facilities. I mean people working there, people teaching there. DA Boudin mentioned 800 people coming and going from the San Francisco jail every day during a pandemic. So even for folks who are skeptical watching this, I hope the public health risk of failure to protect people by bringing them out of those facilities, failure to protect people by diminishing the population numbers in those facilities will still hit home for you. That you will think back on the words of Trayvon Thompson to his sister, and perhaps thinking about the actual human lives at stake and the families who love them, the families who want them home. You might get involved in these kind of issues. You might pay more attention to your local DA race or your local sheriff race, or visit a city council meeting or a county board of supervisors meeting. Because these policies that put fewer people in cages and make everyone safer, are having a moment when your investment and your attention can make all the difference in the world to folks like Trayvon Thompson. So that is our show for today. But before we go, I have to note that today is the last day of perhaps the heart and soul of our program. One of the folks who's been here since the very beginning on our program, Kelly Young, who has been absolutely instrumental in making this program what it is today. And it's been just an amazing joy, a great colleague, a great producer. So everyone here on the Appeal Live would like to say their thanks to Kelly for being phenomenal. I'm sure you're blushing somewhere watching this and wishing I would shut up, which I will now do. But thank you, Kelly, for all the work you put in from all of us. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. You can follow the Appeal News on Facebook, the Appeal on Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us on the